it seems like you never get to a lot of the cool features, which is really an injustice to the designer, because coming from a design background originally, you realize how much effort and work is put into these comps. Like, it's not just things are spaced out just sporadically. Like, there's a very clear intention, and it's really about being fair and working quickly enough to do a lot of these things justice and not shortchange anyone just based on because you're not working fast enough, to be honest. Yeah, as I mentioned before, it's scalable and not dependent on the market. I'll kind of jump into that as far as object-oriented CSS. And also, this is a big one too. As I mentioned before, when you're contracting or working on an island and not dealing with other theme developers, you have a certain style that works for you. And you therein take the blame or the praise for it. But when you're dealing with these partner teams that are like 3 to 5 themers and you're all working in tandem, you're trying to build a baseline of components that they can extend upon, that they're not starting from the beginning. So you have very baseline things that maybe they can add a class to this or that. So you're not replicating your efforts, I guess is my point. Cool. What are benefits? Obviously, don't repeat yourself. It's a pretty obvious one. Less code is less factors to really debug, and that's not really necessarily just from layout. It's also from scaling up, right? So when you're leaning on things like container percentages and things like that, you're relying on the outline container layout pieces of your site. So you're not dealing with hard widths, things like that. So you're really making it malleable so you can kind of move things around. And if you have flexible panels and things like that, you're not pigeonholing yourself in a certain structure where you basically, it's like a copy and paste or re-nesting your SAS or things like that. So leaning on decoupled code. As I mentioned before, we'll jump into this as far as the structure versus skin scenario. I think it, in my opinion, allows your theme to be more predictable. So if you're encountering issues on one level, on one page that is less contextually affected, then it's easier to debug as a whole. Because you should see certain symptoms if you're using essentially the same component, just different regions, or the same region, because you're dealing with it as a component, not as defining it by a body class based on a region, based on certain markup. You're creating a lot more effort, really, honestly, than needs to be there. Consistency of style direction. This is everything from style tiles to style guides. A lot of this is just properly, as I mentioned before, it's really planning things out well and communicating with the team. I may go off on a tangent in this a little bit, but it's the whole concept of sprints, right? Just the nomenclature of sprinting. Like a Doberman Pinscher is running after you, and you're running full speed as quick as you can. I think just the first couple sprints really needs to be about planning for the next couple sprints and building on that. Like, it's not all about what you have to show after the first couple sprints, right? Like, it's going to be nice, you're going to have pieces or whatnot, but why burn through so much granular details when the site's not going to launch for like 7 months, right? And there's going to be changes and things like that. So a lot of that is communication, honestly, and just saying, hey, I know you're looking for certain MVP things in the first 3 weeks, but it really doesn't make any sense. You know, there's no point in putting the paint on at the beginning, you know, when you're basically putting up the framework. In tandem with that, like I said, was the development time. I noticed that on a lot of projects, so much effort and earnest work is put in at the beginning, but it's not really repeatable, right? So if you're not setting things up as components, modular pieces so that you can plug in different I guess, spaces on the page, and that the client basically can't screw up easily, then you're actually not doing justice to the end of the project. So in different examples, like Magic the Gathering and things like that, we had different beans that needed to be stubbed out with Flexslider and things like that. So if you're painting yourself in a corner with certain layouts and certain very distinctly defined theme rules, then it's another copy and paste job, and you're literally duplicating the code when you could add maybe 5% to an existing bean block by etching it out with a preprocessed function or something to that effect. And as I mentioned before, being true to the visual intention of the designer. I won't harp on it too much, but as I mentioned before, it's when you're accepting someone else's work and they're leaning on you to implement it, it's not to sound preachy, but you're doing a lot of people disservice by not getting to the good parts of the design, because certain things are almost like the flagship neat things about the site. And if you're not getting to that because you're duplicating code that you should have properly planned out better and things like that, it just sucks. So why are these methods more important now than ever, as in, what is it, August 1st? Okay, let's step back in time. I had to put at least 3 GIFs, or they wouldn't let me in the room. No, this is the recent history of theme development, or as I say, you kids get off my lawn. As I mentioned before, I started back in 2007. Things were much different back then. Not just with Drupal, but front-end engineering as a whole. So if you look at this very basic timeline, and we're assuming that you're dealing with Drupal 8, just for argument purposes, there's a lot of differences overall. And as I mentioned, it's not just Drupal, it's front-end as a whole. So if you look at these two things, they're working simultaneously, the progression of Drupal and the progression of front-end development. There's 2 things that really stand out. The top one is Drupal specific, right? Like, I think it's no surprise to anyone in the room about the difficulty in controlling output or rendered markup in a content management system. If you don't know about it and you're just starting out, surprise. It's challenging in some regards, other times it's easy. Once again, it's no one's fault, it's just the progression of the project. A lot of things have been worked on, and a lot of people have put in a lot of time to make things much easier. So it's, in a way, until you take on certain responsibilities with PHP preprocessing, theme hook suggestions, things like that, you're actually adding more work, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Also, the front-end tools. I mean, not to sound like an old man, but things nowadays are so different as far as your ability to quickly accelerate your theme, as far as, everything from grunt, gulp, sass, nesting, setting in calculations for mix-ins, things like that. Like, it's great, right? Like, now instead of a toothbrush, you have a jackhammer. But you have a jackhammer, right? So you can quickly get things to a point where they're out of control. You have bloated markup, and we're not talking like, the compressed CSS file is 10 bytes over, right? You're talking very non-extendable code that poor soul that comes in 6 months after you're gone is like reusing large chunks of code. Nothing is really pattern-based. It's just very specific on what they needed to do. I was working on a project, I want to say a year ago, for a large television network, and one of the team members, no fault of his own, it's just his style was so specific about his styling. He was literally going down the DOM tree, child selector, 15 child selectors deep for a paragraph tag. I shit you not. Like, and you look at it and you're like, okay, well, no one's gonna, straight out of the book, baby. Like, and whatever, maybe he was late, he wanted to get a burrito or whatnot, but it was just, when I saw it, I was like, it kind of drove the thing home, right? Like, you're basically just adding more work that doesn't need to be there by not communicating with other team members, right? So a lot of these front-end tools are amazing. Like, things are obviously way better than they ever have been, but, gasp, our front-end methods need to catch up with our front-end tools. Like, we've come so far with a lot of front-end tools, and it's more of an engineering scenario than the old days, CSS, copy and paste, like several lines of code, even with the grids, and a lot of people think, oh, okay, well, the grids are just the containers. Like I mentioned before, most of the work you're going to deal with are these inner components, headlines, spacing pictures, responsive pieces, different breakpoints, things like that. They're very specific to certain components instead of just the boring, outside layout, panels, layouts, things like that. So not to get off on another tangent, but I think at times it's good to pump the brakes, so to speak, with what we're doing. Just because you can nest something in SAS, great, but I've seen it so much to where you're literally creating like an exponential amount of code that doesn't need to be there, that someone else is going to have to read through or is getting loaded to the browser every time, you know, they're hitting these pages. And once again, these are high traffic sites. These are large, heavily used sites. And performance is a big deal. But I think a lot of us, it's kind of like you address it at the end and, okay, I'll minify things and things like that. But a lot of performance in general is addressing issues and not creating technical debt that is just as bad as creating a bug, right? Because a bug is an issue of something that needs to be adjusted. Technical debt is something you're carrying around in your backpack, right? It's not something that you can just knock out. You have to rewind and refactor a lot of things, which is obviously a lot more impactful than some annoying IE8 bug that the CEO's sister saw or something like that. Let's see. Okay, let's get to the good part. Methods of this component-driven engineering. This starts out with a bit of a resounding statement. The responsibility by the themer to dictate the markup and not to react to it. So I'll say that again, the responsibility to dictate the markup as far as it's your markup to style, it's your layout to dictate. So you are in charge of the markup. Does views render it? Does panels render it? Yes. Does a backend engineer maybe create a custom theme function to give to you? Yes. Are you in charge of it? Yes. So in the end, it's really your responsibility. So if things aren't jiving with what you need to do, then it's your responsibility to take ownership of it. Because at the end of the day, you're the one 10 o'clock at night working bugs against the deadline. So it's really, I mean, I'm not saying you need to put draw a line in the sand with a lot of the things, but a lot of it is communication, right? It's just following a certain pattern and communicating, and not just saying, okay, this is what I've been given, I'm going to accept it, and I'll just have to kind of work around it. I'll override an inheritance that was previously inherited like a month ago that's slightly different, so now I have to triple override it or something insane like that. But this isn't an easy task. Because it is Drupal, right? So you have panels, fields in the panels, you have views, and at the end, a form API. Everything is completely different, right? Like you're dealing with like HTML5 article tag, here you're dealing with an awesome super loop of fields and inner field collections, I believe. At the end, you're dealing with the form API, so you're jumping in with some hook form alters, you're adding some prefix, suffix items, and this is all to adjust things mildly close. And as I mentioned before, div IS isn't something we all don't know about, but you can also sidestep it, right? Like you don't have to say, okay, this is what I have to do, right? I'm like, okay, I'm attacking panel pane 4, and then I'm going to dig down in field items. Oh shit. Someone changes around, like this is actually nested under here, so you have to then adjust it. Like it's just, you're chasing your own tail at some point, right? So you can step around it and just, during this transition time, look at certain things with, okay, there's a lot of markup, but I'm in charge of what I'm targeting, right? So I think that's a lot of it too, is just accepting the scenario the way it is and just taking it from there. Just a quick example of this concept. First method, which we've all done. Once again, this is, everyone has done it to some degree or not, and they've reacted to a class or defined a class, right? Just depending on the scope, how much time you have. Like, I'm not going to tell you that you should be strict about overriding all your field collections, all your entities, things like that. Like, I'm not saying get insane with it, but I'm saying like the major repeatable layer parts of it, as far as the components, this is definitely what you're looking at. So you have all this markup, right? And then you have this amazing grid 2 that is, we haven't got to that part, right? So this is reacting, and this is kind of what I mentioned before. you have things clustered together at the top right of the code. So you have a footer, you have some search results, just to have a width of 40%, padding, you got a border, font, something happened there, and some floating, right? So that is all jumbled up in one big collection, probably being spit out from nesting of SAS, things like that. Underneath, same thing, a booking engine that I had worked on. All that markup, see how specific things get, div to a form, to different selectors, to a specific ID on a form. Like, it's tough to read, right? And that's, even the person writing it is tough to read. And then, as I mentioned before, you're dealing with code that at some point you're handing off to someone else, right? Open it up, and they have to read through all that situation, right? So, and as I mentioned before, we've all done it, but you don't really have to, right? Like, at some point, you just have to look at it and say, it's a bad idea, right? It's sloppy, it's messy. Like, let's just not deal with it. We can step around it, and you don't have to react to things. Like, you can be proactive, right? So simple things, and this is just a Drupal 7. And as I mentioned before, a lot of these things still transcend between 7 and 8. The techniques will change, because the creating your own theme functions, things like that, that are going to be different with Twig, but it's still the same concept, right? At the top, you have like a views preprocessed function. So you're looking for certain things just to add a grid to. As I mentioned before, just very simple 45%, just for an example of stacking these modularly, right? So you can keep this very precise, even have some responsive breakpoints in there that kicks it to 100%. It's pretty simple stuff, right? Below panels pane, you have all these different types of panes, and you can run through and match grids according to this. And this works extremely well because you're then dictating, I'm just dealing with grid 2. Like, I don't know what else is going on out there, and I don't know what will happen in the future. But at this point in time, I'm saying, this is what I'm relying on to do the layout, right? And things will change on the inside, and you can add inside containers to extend upon that. But at least you're setting up the initial layout so you can extend upon that, right? As basic as you can, with maybe not even a float is needed or a margin, but you get my point. Moving on to object-oriented CSS, it's actually been around, I think, since 2009. Nicole Sullivan, who did a lot of rework on the Facebook interface, proposed this, and essentially it's the concept of using object-oriented CSS, which is completely different than object-oriented PHP. It's encouraged to reuse ultimately faster and effective style sheets that are easier to maintain. And we'll kind of jump into an examples. It's a bit of an abstract explanation, and some of you that are familiar with it maybe have seen this, but I'll jump into just these two parts. It's basically two main components, right? You're separating the structure and the skin, and you're also separating the container and the content. So if we look at a very common side block class, right? And we're doing some pretty basic stuff, adding padding, min height, all these things are mixed together, right? So these things are jumbled together in a fashion that you can't decouple them. So it's a matter of going down, like if you match the green and the beige with how you would abstract these, right? So you would have these pulled out, so you would have skin-specific branding, obviously, visual elements separate from the structure. So you're leading yourself then to have structure that is then based on just the structure, right? So you can reuse certain classes within that structure then to kind of build upon. So it may seem a bit tedious, but it is actually quite important, right? To have those things separated out. Real quick, we'll jump into the next part. And this is separating the container and the content. A lot of times we read the DOM as if it's our guideline to style it, right? Like we're like, okay, we have this markup. Within this markup, we're going to target it sequentially to get things done, instead of dictating certain classes that can be used regardless of whether it's an H2, an H3, something that's pulled in from a field collection that's looped through properly. You can add a class that way. That's the main component as far as with this. It's just abstracting the need for the markup to be consistent instead of relying on the class instead of literally the semantic H2 whatnot. And as I listed below, the example is the requirement is that the H2 needs to reside according to the inheritance within the footer, and there's not really any flexibility, right? Like it can't be anything else. A better way would be is if you just target it with a dot header tag, just any example, just that can be fluid for many other things. So you're not really pigeonholing yourself into whatever views is thrown at you, whatever panels is thrown at you. You're actually saying, okay, this is where I'm pointing, and I'm going to deal with the other stuff as it changes. Another important kind of progressive part of this is just the enhancement as far as the reusable patterns. It's keeping things very basic as far as classes, right? Because I think as you progress in this, you get a little more fancy, so to speak, with your selectors and trying to combine things, and you have inheritance trumping other inheritance, and it gets a little unwieldy. This way you're keeping things very basic, right? Like you have markup, and I know this is much cleaner markup than we're all accustomed to, at least at this point with Drupal 7, but you have a block, body, so you're targeting just certain aspects of a specific class. So once again, you're not targeting this headliner as an H2 or whatnot. You're not leaning on the markup being as strict as you need it to be, at least at that point. You're actually leaning on certain class definitions that you're setting that is driving that then you can extend upon, right? Because you can actually use this headliner in any place. So why not combine these classes instead of having a selector and your like 12 lines of very specific code that certain chunks will be used. Sometimes you may override it, but other times you may just use two things out of there. So why not use those two things and transcend that across multiple classes? So in this example, you're kind of combining text white, which is obviously specific for the skinning, the dude, obviously. As far as the background image, golden block, just having a border. It's more of a mixing together of classes than a very specific direction, right? Because you're actually progressively adding to this, right? So by saying, okay, I'm in control of the markup, I'm going to add this class at this point, you're just building upon what your teammate has done like a month before. Like these definitions are already in place. You're just focusing on the markup instead of dealing with whatever you're trying to change and just being too specific about it or not really caring about how it impacts patterns or really being extendable. And then at that point, it's more of just, I think this is my second GIF. Okay, maybe I hit the limit. But it's more of a matter then of progressing past this, right? So you're combining multiple things together, obviously very different things, into an end result. So you then have a pattern library, and not like a component library. You have a class library that you're combining together to get to an end goal. Last thing I'm going to jump on here is a case study, and this is to show very specific kind of techniques that worked well in this project. I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with Magic the Gathering. It's, from what I read, the most widely used card playing game in the world. It's been around for a little bit, but it's actually gotten very popular the last couple years. So it's basically, I told you I would wake you up with a razzle at some point. So it's essentially a client out of Seattle that deals with these types of tournaments and things. So very visual, very video heavy, very image heavy. And you're not talking with, okay, we're gonna keep this capped at 1440 pixels. You're talking like my Lightning display at home, stretching this all the way, and you have massive images. As I mentioned before, here's some of the key factors and ingredients. There's a heavy emphasis on combining modular blocks and layouts. A lot of this was panelizer type stuff, panels, a combination of different things, but allowing the authors to kind of combine different promotions. Sometimes they'd have like 4 different Flexslider panels on the same page, and with panelizer they're kind of dragging and dropping, choosing what they want, promotion, different sections. So you're building things in a modular way so that they're adding to it, and very specific configuration on those beans, which I'll get to those in a second, as far as like just changing one configuration in the bean as far as your entities is a completely different Flexslider layout, right? So you then have theme hook suggestions that are set in place to have like a baseline TPL file, and then depending on the configuration, you're adding certain classes, you know, left, right, whatnot. As I mentioned before, very large images and videos, which is kind of nice. Good change of pace. Need for various carousels, not just in the banner. You're talking like 4 or 5 sometimes. Sliding through different things like that, and making sure things are stubbed out so that they all work in tandem and don't kind of bump into each other. So you could have 2 beans, which if you guys don't know what beans are, think of them as blocks on steroids, so to speak. So they're more true to the entity style. So you can extend these much further, and they're a little more difficult at the pre-process level to deal with, but once you have things wrangled to a point, they're actually, I think, pretty cool, because you can really extend upon certain things like theme hook suggestions and kind of go down in proper switch case elements and really kind of stub things out and combine classes and things like that, rather than just having like a bazillion freaking TPLs, which is horrible. And as I mentioned before, authors had a big focus on beans and the panelizer. As far as you've built all these components out, it now needs to work in whatever fashion they want. No matter columns, four regions next to each other, one large, it's very flexible. So each component has the ability to have inner layouts, and that was, as I mentioned before, like different configurations. So as far as like text left, background, whatever, and you have a repository of images to pull from, and removing the container dependency, removing the dependency in the layout from the container. They wanted, for example, you would have like a set width or max width on some of these panels. For some reason, it's just a style, and 2 or 3 of those at the top, and then you would have some background image that would have to go full page, right? So you aren't dealing with one solid container. Everything had to deal with its own container, its own inner pieces, and its own inner responsive elements. So if you look at these are essentially the bean blocks. You'll see they're very similar. Like if you look at them from a layout perspective, right? Like they obviously look a lot different based on font choices and images, but when you kind of boil it down, they're fairly straightforward, right? Like you have certain things that are aligned a certain way and based on the percentage of their container. So you're not dealing with setting the inner container elements. You have a whole separate class for that. So in the top you have, it's highlighted in red, text left, text right. Once again, the very simple example, it gets much more detailed than this, but for the purposes of what we're talking about, we'll just stick with this. So you can see extremely consistent. So the layout, the only real difference is, like in this example is a banner. You have vertical lines, certain things that wrap a certain way, but it's really about combining, as I mentioned before, combining these classes, right? So you have things that are aligned a certain way that are based on width percentages. Lose my picture. Right on. Okay, cool. You're kind of combining these things in a different way, right? So this is a Flexslider markup, so you have to kind of depend on the slide's namespace, and you're dealing with different things as far as wrapping or the actual inner pieces of the content, which if you look at the headline and the tagline, you deal with those separately, right? Like you're not bundling these all up in one big nested SAS cluster, right? Like you're abstracting these out so you can compartmentalize what you're changing. So you can combine certain types of slides with certain types of layouts, with certain types of horizontal spacing or alignment, I guess, top, left, right, and it can deal with overflows and things like that. So So yeah, that's it as far as the case study part. I just wanted to kind of jump into that too, because I think contextually it helps looking at this from an implementation standpoint, as far as real world, and not just, okay, this is another talk about a new technique that probably will work. It's the latest fad and try it out. It may not work. You know, like this is actually something that even before this project, we dealt with a lot and works really well across enterprise teams, and is more apparent how much better it works across enterprise teams. So that's it. Yep. Here's my final, but yeah, if you guys have any questions, fire them off. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
So the big question that I think is very important to answer is the Drupal theme layer better outcomes? I think the current state of the Drupal theme layer, the current state of the architecture that we see.
I would say on a basic level, I could extend, if you want to talk to me afterwards, I could extend upon like the very common patterns. Yeah, like you said, part of it is proprietary, but a lot of the methods are right in line with what we just showed. So I can kind of show you how, I guess, the best way to stub certain things out distinctly and kind of go that route. But yeah, as you mentioned, like when you get to a certain part, when you're mixing together 4 different classes, things do get unwieldy. But when you kind of break it down on the very simple layout of structural layouts, it's not as complicated. It's just when you're dealing with an exponential number, when it gets to 20 different layouts, it's like, oh my God, this is rough to follow. But if you follow it from a very core, starting back to Lebowski example, if you start from the very basics of a foundation and build upon it, it's much easier to kind of follow the context around it. But good question. Yes, ma'am.
Well, this is very dangerous. And the reason why is, you're not reinventing the wheel, sure, but you're duplicating functionality. You're duplicating our existing Drupal.
Magic the Gathering? Yeah. Well, for that one, it was just myself. And then at the end, after we launched, I worked with another team to, I think they had 2 or 3 other themers. Yeah, build on that. And I was very cognizant of that, too, because, as I mentioned before, when you're working on these smaller sites, opposed to like a site that big with that much traffic, that you're dealing with these humongous videos and things like that, you really have to be disciplined in what you're doing. There's several ways to do many things, right? So it's being just very empathetic to whoever is taking over your code and kind of taking pride in it and saying, I'm going to take the time out to properly comment things, to document it. So when I hand things over, like, okay, here's 10 classes that I used to build this. Here's the pre-processed functions that I'm stubbing things out. And then they can take it at that point. Where there's been other projects where I've jumped in later on where we've had to just kind of take the project at where it's at. So you can go through, I mean, you don't have to rewire things, right? Like you can take things a certain direction and take it a cleaner direction without being distracted to the team and the methods that they're already, riling up the rooster, so to speak. You can still take it a certain direction with also being cognizant of, somehow implying you're rewiring things, just a more distinct, I guess, direction, so to speak. Did that answer? Okay, cool. Anyone else?
Drupal, from the point of view of someone who's using Angular or Ember or React, is...
Cool, okay. Yeah, if you have any questions, we can talk afterwards. But yeah, you can contact me through any of these. Probably Twitter I'm on the most. So yeah, thanks again. And I know I'm a little short, so yeah, that's it. Thanks.
There isn't a canonical backend.
Oh, thank you so much.
We're entering a component building.
Oh, hey, sir. Jason, nice to meet you.
It helps put a lot of things into think about perspective.
Oh, yeah, no, that's awesome.
what you're talking about. So like, as much of the features and code elements we want in CSS. We've been trying to talk about how are we going to try to modularize.
Yeah, and it's hard too because it's like it's such a different style for some people that it's like you have to be like, listen.
It's a different approach to thinking.
Yeah, because depending on how long you've been doing CSS, it's like you're so accustomed to going a certain way, and when you're telling other people or saying, oh, this is actually adding development time at the beginning, like people are going to be a little more, yeah.
Well, and I think we have an opportunity to choose something involved.
Oh, gotcha, yeah.
We have an monthly engagement as a side factor.
Oh, nice, okay, yeah. Not only, but I left my bag.
Just to follow up on what I asked.
Sure.
You were the person who started with laid out architecture. Do you find that that's the best place to start and then?
That's an excellent question. Yes, if at all you can help it, just because you're setting the initial rules, and it's not really like, oh, I don't want to inherit